So since we have Michelle here, it would be great to hear a verbal recount of the Mexican government and how it's structured, so we can have a little bit more insight on that. And for those of you who have your textbook, there is a country profile in Mexico on page 468.
Okay, let's start. Well, Mexico is a presidential democracy, and we elect the president through a plurality of popular votes, which I would say is one of the main differences between the political system in the US and the how the president gets elected in Mexico. So what this means is that the president, well, the candidate that has more votes wins directly. There's no second round, there's no majority of votes, just the one that has more votes than the other, which for me, I think it's one of the biggest problems because there's no like a clear mandate, I would say. And also, I don't think that's very legitimate because many of the presidents before AMLO, that's our actual president, I will go to that in a minute, have been elected with a 30% of votes. So I see that as one of the things that we have to work with or modify in our political system. And going into the structure of the government, Mexico has three branches. One, it's the executive, that's represented by the president. The legislative, that's with the Congress, that's bicameral. So we have the Chamber of Deputies and the senators, and the judicial system comprised by our Supreme Court. What else?
Can I just interrupt to say that this actually has a very similar legal system to the United States. It's basically a mixture of a civil legal system with the U.S. constitutional theory, as your textbook will point out.
Oh yeah, like I see that in theory and in structure, but as what I have been experiencing is that they're usually aligned with the president's ideology, so there's no much of a counterpart into making legislation. So if it's basically like if the president has a new mandate or a new policy, it just passes. There's not enough argument about it or a counterbalance either. And I think for you guys, you do have a counterbalance on that part.
We're supposed to have a good checks and balances system. It's interesting though, because there is a lot of similarities, like that is bicameral.
Oh yeah.
And I see also that an interesting thing about the system is that the voting is compulsory, though it's not enforced. And that's something we talked about previously in the class, is which countries have where you have to vote and which ones don't. And certain countries have like a financial penalty for citizens who don't come out to vote. Yeah,
wow.
Brazil. So it's interesting that Mexico has compulsory voting, but it's not actually enforced by fines or something like that.
It's very laissez, I would say. Like most of the population has been in disagreement with the candidates, like with all of the candidates, that they just think they're gonna change the political system by no voting at all. So that's why we have 30% of approval when a president gets elected, because many of the population, like, they're not agree or they don't like either of the candidates. And since it's just like we just get one round of voting and then it's official.
So there's no primary vote?
No, there's no.
And I see that in Mexico, there's many more political parties than in the United States, or at least more that have a larger percent of the vote.
Yeah.
Is there one in particular that stands out to you, or do you have any commentary on the different political parties?
Yeah, I wanted to explain, especially the political parties, because as you say, like we have many political parties, and I think that I actually gonna send some images so you can present them to the class. But out of all the political parties we have, it basically comes out just to four of them. That's one, it's PRI, the other one, PAN, PRD, and Morena.
Hmm.
Those are like our main four parties, I would say. So they have been evolving through the time. We haven't had these parties at the beginning of our history. So first we started with the PRI. That's the Revolutionary Institutional Party. And this party actually ruled Mexico for 70 years. So that's like our hidden dictatorship, because we had a policy. Well, it wasn't like an official policy, but what would happen is that the former president will just point out to the next candidate, and that's the one that has been elected for the next term. So we call it dedazo, like when you just point out the other candidate that's going to get elected. And I think that's one of the things that make Mexico so tired of policy, because we actually weren't having a voice in policy making or electing. It was just very crooked and corrupted system. And I think that's one of the main reasons the population doesn't trust the system very much, or doesn't want to go out and vote.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
The other party, I would say the second main party is the PAN. That's Actional National Party, and it is a very famous one here in Mexico because it started to be the counterbalance to the first party, the PRI, and but it didn't bring much peace or change either. It was as corrupted, I would say, as the last one. And also, well, it's a very conservative, that's our conservative party. And it's also guided by the Catholic Church, which has a lot to do with the policy making in this party, and it represents the business private sector interest. So I think that's how you know like what's the main ideology in Mexico and why, because of the parties that rule Mexico. So in the center and north of the country, we have a very major region represented by the PAN, which are the conservative ones. And then we have the PRD party. This one promotes social reforms, expansion of welfare programs, support from the South and for the region, economic nationalism, social justice, and it's like our more liberal party.
Mm-hmm.
And this was actually founded, if I'm not wrong, by the former president of Mexico. That's Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, as we call him. He was first part of the PRI, then he founded the PRD, and then he founded the new main party of Mexico, that's Morena, which stands for National Regenerational Movement. And it really represents the far left and the far right, which is very confusing.
You think that it represents both the left and the right?
Yeah, on the extremes. Like, yeah, I know. It's very confusing for the population too.
I'm sure. That's very interesting though. And if you see in the textbook, there's the same order of popularity that she's just explained. What I found really interesting was that one party had political rule for 70 years. Obviously, that's a really long time. And It says actually in the textbook from 1920 to 2000, Mexico is ruled by these reformists from the revolution who started the party. Uh,
Yeah.
so that's interesting, and it does characterize them as well. It doesn't characterize the party as corrupt and repressive, but it says that the government in Mexico became increasingly so as time went on. So since 2000, it looks like there's been more of an effort to reform the government. Would you say that's true?
Well, I would say that in the beginning, like this party was founded in the revolution. So they really represent like all the revolution movement in Mexico. That was in 1920. And then they didn't change and started to making just convenient policies, I would say, for the governors and people of influence that were supporting them. That's mainly the rich people and yeah, the rich people in Mexico. So as policy, like if they're left, right, they are centrist and they move with conveniency in the international policy. So I think I mean, it has a good side and a bad side.
Very interesting. Um, and I also know that Mexico has a colonial history, having been ruled by Spain for several centuries. So I think that now people don't really think about it as a country that's a former colony. Similarly to the US, we're not really thinking about that because it happened so long ago within our mindset. But how do you think that affected how the political parties developed? Do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I also don't want to go that deep because I'm not very well studied into anthropology and the consequences. But I also want to point out that the colony was very different from how it developed in the US and how it happened in Mexico, because we had a more homogeneous population. And since the population was very, very mixed, um, as a colony, the population also developed the this system that's either you want to be like the country you got colonized by, or you want to fight that system with all your heart, you know either. And this, you can see it in the north and south. Like the north part of Mexico, they're more like they got more a mixed race with the Spaniards, I would say. So they want to be more European. They want to imitate the global north, but the south part, that's mostly comprised by our indigenous people, and also our outcast and vulnerable groups. It's more, they want to fight that policy because they are the outcasts. They're not included by any of the government policy. Like even our Afro-descendant community just got recognized this year by the government. So we have this system where they ask, just to take into consideration, like all the population, what's their part in the system? Are they employed? Are they students? There's a study that's been done by the INEGI. That's the system that takes into consideration the Mexican people. But like they didn't take into consideration first the indigenous people and now like the Afro-descendant community. So just by this year, they're taking them into consideration as Mexicans.
Wow. I think it's similar around the world, very unfortunately. But thank you for sharing that about Mexico specifically. Um,
I know. It's
it's
For me, it's very crazy. It's like, what? We're in 2020 already.
And particularly just the plight for Indigenous groups around the world is something that I've been speaking about in my class the last couple of times, looking at how land that's designated for conservation may often displace Indigenous groups, for example. And both Michelle and I were on a call and a webinar for WeCan, which is actually, do you know what it stands for exactly?
I think I have the definition here. I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, I'm having a mental blank. But we joined a call on Thursday, which I had linked the class to. And that was about how Indigenous communities in Ecuador and Brazil are facing unique challenges while COVID-19 pandemic is happening. And something that really touched me from that was hearing about how this pandemic can in some ways serve to distract the news and the publics and defenders of Indigenous rights from some of the violations that are currently occurring simultaneously with the pandemic. So, for example, there were anecdotal reports of deforestation increasing in several Indigenous territories, as well as illegal mining happening. So, and it's also very difficult to have official recording of some of these claims because of the pandemic and its implications. So, I don't know if you had any comments from that webinar as well.
It was very, very rough to hear that perspective. And like, I feel it's our duty to expand the word, since they did their job to collaborate at the webinar and bring all this information. And since, yeah, they're like the most vulnerable group and they're being attacked in their own home and they can't do anything about it, or like even the international community are just dragged by the coronavirus crisis that's not a trending topic or won't be a trending topic as a consequence. So I feel from that webinar what um, I really um, take as very important is our responsible as change makers to bring that awareness to the subject.
Thank you. I also wanted to, sorry for switching from the topic of Mexico momentarily,
It's okay.
but what I found really disturbing was the lack of national protocols reported regarding COVID-19 for this vulnerable group. And it's something that we're seeing for the homeless populations as well. Often the governments are not giving specific response plans for people in need. So that's just increasing vulnerability of these groups within this crisis. And I think in the aftermath, we don't want to have to see that in the aftermath. We want to have to prevent it now. So that webinar was a really important call to action for people who are doing this political work.
It was.
Just to give a couple quotes from that webinar, because I don't want to, have it all coming from our mouths. Someone said that this is from Patricia, who is in the Ecuadorian Amazon. She said, Indigenous people are facing double or even triple crises, and on top of that, COVID-19. So they're already reporting that their communities were in crisis situations before this happened. Another thing is that someone said, the same woman, she said, we are also living the impacts of climate change. So the climate change situation, if you guys would refer back to Ora Bogada's keynote about how climate change and climate debt affects the global north differently from the global south, we know that climate change is actually coming to several parts of the world, including indigenous communities and more countries that like as I'm saying right now, that can pretty much only anecdotally explain the significance of what's happening right now, and that it's not something in the future. Another thing I just wanted to say is that there is calls for the international community to help in these situations. So we should consider ourselves as students and people of justice, that it's something we need to do to spread the information. So I don't know if you
Yeah.
want to go back, Michelle, to the topic of Mexico, or how would you like to?
I wanted to add something because I wrote a quote that I found very positive towards what we can do. You know, like there's a lot of impositiveness going around, especially to discuss this and climate change and dealing with the COVID crisis at the same time. So I found this. Let me search for the quote because I found it very truthful and helpful too. So, okay, so one thing they say that I loved was now with the quarantine and lockdown, we have the time to have imagination to create another system, to map another world, to map another form of economy, a circular one where nature is taken into consideration and our people are taken into consideration with dignity and peace. So it's our time to share this to the world. And that was it. So I really found it very, it brought me hope and peace. And I think they're right. Like, we have time now. We need to get our minds into creating something that includes all of us.
Now I just want to do something about it, but
We can. I mean, I will share because I know you missed just the very end, but they shared a lot of links where either you can share it, you can donate to these special communities because they don't have access either um, to the face mask or gels. So the government is not supporting them directly. I think that's where we can do our part, you know,
I,
or share it and get more information about it. Also, they share the nature's rights chart, and I think that would be a very good thing to share too.
yeah, we'll make sure to send that out. And it's great how when webinars like this are produced, that they also make sure to follow up and
Yeah,
provide us the resources to stay involved, whether or not it's donating or some other way.
yeah. I feel like you can also connect so easy. Like for me, it was so surprising how we could connect with people from around the globe and get them in board of supporting that cause.
Definitely. Do you have more to say on Mexico, or I have some other things I want to ask you and bring up, but it's up to you how we go.
Okay, so I think I'm just gonna finish giving some of my personal opinion on the government. Well, not personal, just how it works, kind of different. That I think it would be good to take into consideration if you are studying comparative politics. And one of the things that shocked me that I hadn't taken into consideration is that we have one 6-year term president. Like all of our elections, they get elected for just one term that lasts 6 years. So I think that's one of the main reasons of why we not make the government accountable for their projects or their investment, because either like as soon as they finish their long term, the next term would be totally different with new programs, and all the older programs they would just get ripped off and not taken into continuity. And also like the professionals, they would be fired and they would bring new professionals pointed out by the president. So I think that's one of the main issues around policy making in Mexico, because we every 6 years we change radically from party to policy making to international investment, and also to social programs and the departments of state. It changes radically. And that's one of the things I think that brings a lot of instability to the country. And it's based on our political system.
Thank you so much for that insight. And I think there's a lot of political debate about how different term limits will affect the well-being of the nation, and how it will affect how issues are progressed.
Yeah.
Because we see always a huge, not to say that there's always a huge shift, because it depends, but at least in this last transition from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, we've seen a huge shift in the spending towards certain issues. And I'm going to be neutral and not condemning this sort of thing, but to point out that there's been a huge change in budget. So those implications have such big consequences, and we can see that that's also timing that's aligned with the term limits.
Yeah, and I think that's actually how you can tell if um, they're into is the president or the campaign as a full, if they're into a long term with helping the citizens, or just doing stuff for look good towards their term.
Definitely.
So yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you something about the MeToo movement.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because one of my students in this class, Emma Carey, co-wrote a very interesting piece on what have been the legal changes since the MeToo movement. So that's something I just wanted to highlight because it's awesome, and she allowed me to share it with the class, so I'll be sending that out as well. But I'm wondering if you have any insights on how that movement played out within the Mexican context, because it was huge in the United States, and we also had a huge increase in the calls and the volume of calls to domestic violence hotlines and shelters and that sort of thing. So it had a huge effect in that area. So I'm not sure if you have some insight.
Well, I would say it has been a little bit different for, especially within the Mexican context. It has bring change, I would say, but in a different way. So I think for me, for my generation, I would speak for my generation, it is a big movement, and it has bring a lot of um, awareness towards the feminist movement too. So for that, I'm very glad with the Me Too movement, and because of all the awareness they're bringing into the world, and also all the people that were in the pedestal and weren't taken into, accountability for their actions. So for that, I think they're doing a big shift, especially towards policy and lawmaking. So that's great. But in Mexico, I would say, since it's not very owned by the Mexicans. It depends on which part of the country you are and how familiar you are with international policy and international actors and international movements. So if you have the privilege to be aware, it would be a great cause you will look to fight for and to join and to bring more awareness towards you. But to be honest, most of the population in Mexico they don't have that access. They don't have the access to the information. They don't have the the awareness towards the issue and also the culture, I think it's we are not there yet to bring that law shift.
Thank you. I want to highlight at least one thing that Emma and her co-writers had put forth, which is similar. She says, despite the progress made, victims still face backlash, gender discrimination, and less overt forms of sexual and non-sexual harassment. So, though she explains there are some state legislative actions towards revising existing laws, more harshly punishing perpetrators, and that sort of thing, as well as some high profile convictions related to it. There are still so many of these effects around gender-based violence and gender inequality that need to be addressed still.
Totally.
And an interesting part of that too is going back to, we've talked about in class, de facto versus de jure. So like things that happen according to law and things that are just happening in real life, like by fact.
Yeah.
So even if as these legal things change, a lot has to happen in order to shape society and people so that discrimination ends in the first place.
Yeah, it's like we really need to recreate culture to be inclusive. Like, yeah, get all the people in the table and recreate culture. I think that's the way to do the shift. But for example, in Mexico, there's a lot of backlash move. There's a lot of backlash in the feminist movement.
Mm.
You know, so like just for being a feminist, just for being a woman, you get instantly um, more. I would say you are more. You can get more killed. I don't know how to say that. You can,
You
yeah.
could be more easily targeted for violence.
So with the feminist movement and the feminist march in March, there was a lot of out, outraging violence towards women, you know, because of the feminist movement, and there was a big breakout of violence, and you would see that in the Facebook post, like, oh, if you see a feminist in the street marching for her rights, just kill her or give her a big punch in the face or things like that. And I found that crazy because there's no awareness of what feminist stands for, and there's a lot of misogynist culture in the core of Mexico culture. So yeah, I think the only way is to remake culture, to bring more awareness towards gender equality and ending gender-based violence.
Definitely. I want to shift topics again because I love
Yeah,
doing it. Are you ready?
I love doing that too.
um, so I want to talk a little bit about the terminology on certain topics and how that might change your research. Well, that's just a really small point, is that it might change the way that you approach research, or is something you need to be aware of. But what made me think about this while we're speaking with Michelle is that I take Spanish lessons, and in
Yeah.
Spanish, there's not so much of one way to say homeless person or person experiencing homelessness. Things I've heard before are like persona sin casa, like person without house.
Yeah.
But now my teacher, who's from Argentina, she said to say gente sin techo, so like someone without, people without roof.
Or
What would you say in Mexico?
probably the same. In Mexico, they say, like, they refer to homelessness just you know, with street homelessness. So they say personas en situación de calle.
Mm.
That's how they appoint it. But you know, homelessness is not that. It's not just that vulnerable group. It is a wide vulnerable of groups that are in homelessness situation. So I think there's not a term we have to come with a new terminology.
Right. For
First.
those who don't speak Spanish, persona en situación de calle is like someone literally on the street, in the situation of living on the street. So as we've discussed in class and even today, there's invisible homelessness, that you're not living on the street, but you're still homeless. So that's interesting for sure in
Yeah,
the
we
fight.
have to, if we really want to make it a national policy making, we have to really come to another terminology with homelessness that really involves all the groups involved.
Mhm.
But I don't think there's much awareness towards all the groups involved. Or if there would be, I don't think the government would take such a responsibility.
Plus, it's so difficult in doing this advocacy because there are so many groups that could and should be considered within the homeless category, including survivors of victims and survivors of sex trafficking, often
Migrants,
migrants.
refugees, political asylees, all the students and youth generation that aren't able to afford a house. So they must live with their parents or friends. What else? Street
Doubling up.
homelessness.
So when you have too many people in one home. Our class at least has heard me talk about this so often that I'm sure they've come to reach
They
their,
are very aware.
or I hope so. Another interesting thing around the terminology is when I went to Kenya, because they're in Muslim, I was in Mukuru, they often refer to their home as a self-confused home because everything's happening in the same room, like going to use the bathroom and doing sanitary services, cooking, sleeping, every activity is happening in the same room. And recently, when I spoke with someone from Philippines, I was told that they have a similar saying to describe the same situation called a one-room affair. So
Wow.
even in this way, there's really similar parallels across the world, but things are just really termed differently, and it's so interesting.
I know. And one of the things I was talking actually with my dad, it was if you take each vulnerable group or each person in that's um, involved with the homelessness definition as the one we came with, that would represent more than 70% of the Mexican population.
Hmm.
So that would be a huge deal for the government to deal with, to just admit that more than a half of the population is in homelessness situation.
Definitely.
So I
It's
think
really
that's
misleading because you can't tell when looking at the media and depictions of Mexico often. Um,
yeah.
well, that's the point I wanted to make, but I'm also glad we threw some Spanish in there because one of my desired outcomes of this class is for people to have more of an interest and beginning of learning languages.
Yeah. Well, like you can always practice it with me, and if anyone is interested, you can contact me and practice Spanish too. I love having conversations in Spanish.
I hope you guys take this offer up because this is the Global Goodwill Ambassador of Mexico offering to practice Spanish with you. I wanted to ask about one more thing, if you're willing. Um, it's important, like I've said this in my class before, to look at the biography of someone who's doing political work or who's a political figure, because that can give a lot of insight on what drives someone to help with politics. And by the way, in our class, we have defined politics with the David Easton's definition, which is essentially that politics is the struggle for the authoritative allocation of resources. So we know, like in your political involvement, you're trying a lot to get more resources and attention towards women and other
Yeah.
vulnerable groups. So what helps leads you to your career and um, to this, I guess, platform for yourself?
Oh, can you ask again the question? Sorry.
Yes. Just like, what are some biographical details from you that explain how you came to this political platform of helping women and um, just being a global goodwill ambassador?
Oh, okay. So I think for me was that I got exposed to volunteering since very young.
Mhm.
So I was eager to do social work, and like social work for me is a lifestyle, like just fighting for the great causes, not just of your community, but like for humanity and our planet per se. So I got exposed to many types of volunteering and many vulnerable groups very young, and I developed an empathetic lifestyle. Like if I'm not working for them, I'm not working.
I love that. And what was your educational background?
Okay, so I study international relations, and that brought me because I wanted to do something that could bring change, but from all perspectives. You know, like not just communitary change or national change, but also bring like the international organizations into the system and international actors to bring more direct help that's not I would say masked with the government and the government changes since it changes so often. So I study international relations, and I got the opportunity to be the president and secretary of my career. So with this, I brought many of the organizations and ambassadors and politic figures to our school to give conferences to bring more awareness towards their causes. And that is where I got more involved with the international community since I brought UNESCO Center for Peace into the school. And I really wanted to have more peace culture education. So I joined the organization and the movement, and it helped me to be more aware of my place in the world and what I really wanted to do after I finished the career.
Mm.
So I got more into peace advocacy, and I got the opportunity to participate with them at the United Nations with the CSW. And I think that's when I really found that everything I've been doing, like every single step in my life, was leading towards that, and that that's exactly what I wanted to do for like my life purpose, to advocate and to be more activist and to bring the sustainable development goals to the world, make them a reality by 2030.
Yeah,
So that's a challenge.
it is a challenge, but I'm so glad you're working on it because I'm more confident it will happen with you working on it for sure. Um, well, I want to say thank you so much for being here and for helping me record my class and for giving all your insights on femicide, the government in Mexico, Indigenous rights, and a lot of other topics we got to.
No, thank you for this opportunity. I'm so happy that you invited me. And also, I'm so glad to be your friend and get to work with you on all these amazing causes. So, thank you for that.
Thank you. I'm gonna stop recording now, but you're amazing.